It started with the sound of metal screaming against stone, a sharp drag that sliced through the silence of midnight like a saw through bone, and when I stepped out onto the porch of my lakeside cabin with a flashlight in one hand and my heart trying to escape through my ribs, I saw her, crouched in her pink robe and slippers, holding a tape measure in her mouth like some suburban commando, moving my fence post 1 inch at a time while whispering to her son about jurisdiction boundaries. It took a second for my sleepy brain to process that the HOA queen herself, Karen, was in my yard at midnight with a toolkit and a teenage accomplice, dragging my property line south like she was redrawing the map of Europe. My flashlight caught her face mid-sneer, and she hissed like a vampire caught trespassing. "You can't shine that light on me," she barked, squinting dramatically. "This is HOA business, and you're interfering with official midnight measurements." I just stood there barefoot, the cold deck biting at my feet, wondering if I was still dreaming, but the pile of muddy fence posts beside her said otherwise. Her son, looking half regretful, half bored, muttered, "Mom, this is crazy," but Karen shot him the look of every dictator in training and snapped, "We follow the bylaws, not feelings." Somewhere behind her, a raccoon paused like even nature wanted to see how this show ended. I told her calmly that she was on private property, that the county had already marked the correct boundary last month, but she waved her tape measure like a sword. "The HOA board held an emergency session," she said, "and we voted to reclaim the 12 inches of lake frontage you've been hogging." I asked her if that emergency meeting took place in her kitchen over Chardonnay again, but she ignored me, mumbling to herself about aesthetic symmetry and community lake rights. The beam of my flashlight swept across the ground, and I realized she had already dug up 3 posts, leaving behind raw holes in the earth like open wounds. It wasn't just petty, it was tactical. She wasn't moving the fence for looks. She was shifting the property line before the next county inspection, hoping to make her fake border seem legitimate. My laugh came out half disbelief, half fury. "Karen, it's midnight," I said. "People get arrested for less suspicious activity than this." She stood up, mud splattering her slippers, and declared, "You'll thank me when your property value increases from proper HOA alignment." That line was so absurd I almost applauded. Then came the moment that flipped this entire night from ridiculous to cinematic. A soft hum built in the sky, and I thought it was just the wind echoing off the lake until a flash of red light washed over us. The county drone, the one they use for inspection and wildfire mapping, was gliding silently overhead like some mechanical angel of justice, its camera blinking as it recorded the entire scene. Karen froze mid-step, staring up with her mouth open as if divine judgment had descended. "What is that?" she gasped. "Surveillance," I said, grinning, "and for once it's not mine." Her son muttered something about this being bad, and tried to drag her toward the car, but Karen wasn't leaving without finishing her masterpiece. "They can't prove anything," she said, stabbing a post into the ground at a crooked angle. "We're within our rights." The drone's light followed her like a spotlight on a criminal stage actor, and I swear if it had a speaker, it would have been playing dramatic music. I stood there in silence, arms crossed, watching her argue with her son, the drone, and me all at once, creating a midnight opera of absurdity. 15 minutes later, after she finally retreated with her mud-caked shoes and misplaced pride, I walked along the fence line and realized she had managed to move nearly 6 feet of boundary in her favor. 6 feet, enough to claim part of my dock path. It was both laughable and infuriating, the kind of madness that only HOA logic could justify. The lake glimmered in the moonlight behind me, calm and indifferent, while my property marker stakes lay uprooted like casualties. I wanted to call the sheriff right then, but I hesitated. He'd warned me before. "Let her hang herself with her own rope," he'd said, leaning back in his chair with that knowing smile. Maybe this was that moment. Maybe it was better to let the evidence stack up, especially now that a county drone had captured the world's most ridiculous land heist in 4K. Inside the cabin, I replayed the scene in my head, trying not to laugh out loud. My security cameras caught her headlights coming in at 11:47 p.m., the exact time she must have started digging. That meant this wasn't impulsive, it was premeditated. Karen had planned a midnight fence mission like a military op. I could almost hear her pep talk. Operation Boundary Freedom, Phase 1, secure the aesthetic perimeter. I poured myself a cup of coffee even though it was nearly 1 a.m., knowing sleep was pointless now. The more I thought about it, the more brilliant it became. Not her plan, but the irony of it. The HOA president, self-proclaimed guardian of order, had committed the most chaotic act imaginable, and she'd done it under a county surveillance route. Somewhere, karma was smiling. Still, the stakes weren't small. That fence marked not just my property, but also legal access to the lake path that several neighboring lots relied on. If her stunt went unchecked, the HOA could claim easement control, and that would mean permits, fees, and eventually, total HOA oversight of private land. It wasn't just a petty squabble anymore, it was a prelude to a takeover. I stared at the mud on my porch, the trail of Karen's slippers leading back toward the street, and I felt a mix of anger and amusement burning in my chest. I knew this wasn't over. She'd return, probably with more tools and a bigger sense of righteousness. Then, as if to confirm that fate was on my side, my phone buzzed. It was a county notification, routine inspection footage available for property ID 4427L, my parcel. I opened it, and there she was on screen. Karen, in glorious night vision, struggling with fence posts while her son filmed TikToks of himself sighing. At one point she slipped into the mud and yelled, "This is for the HOA," like a soldier charging into battle. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The video timestamp matched my security feed perfectly. There it was, undeniable proof, recorded by both me and the county. She had not only trespassed, she had documented it. By the time dawn crept over the lake, the absurdity had faded into a quiet sense of resolve. I stepped outside again, the morning air sharp with pine and cold mist. The moved fence looked ridiculous now, zigzagging through the yard like a drunk snake. Birds perched on the misaligned posts as if mocking the human nonsense below. I picked up one of the loose boards and drove it halfway back into the ground, not to fix it, just to mark where she'd been. I wanted it left exactly as evidence. Somewhere behind the trees, a truck engine started, and I caught a glimpse of Karen's SUV disappearing down the hill. She'd be back, I was sure. HOA queens don't surrender after one midnight mission. But next time, she wouldn't just be fighting me, she'd be fighting the county, the sheriff, and the eye in the sky that saw everything. And as the last ripples of sound faded across the lake, I realized the funniest part of all: she still thought she'd won. By the next morning the whole neighborhood was buzzing like a beehive struck by a lawnmower because Karen had called an emergency HOA summit before sunrise and somehow convinced half the residents to attend by promising free coffee and a speech about community unity. I watched from my porch as cars began lining the cul-de-sac, people in mismatched pajamas and lawn chairs gathering in front of her house where she had set up a plastic podium with a hand-painted sign that read Emergency Boundary Hearing. She stood there in her robe again, this time with pearls and sunglasses, clutching a stack of papers like she was about to declare independence from common sense. Her son sat behind her scrolling through his phone, clearly wishing for an invisibility cloak. When I walked over, still nursing my first cup of coffee, a few neighbors gave me sympathetic looks while others whispered as if they were about to witness a live reality show. Karen slammed a gavel on a makeshift table and shouted that the meeting was called to order, then began her tirade about fence aggression and lakefront encroachment. She gestured wildly toward my property like she was pointing at enemy territory. "This man," she said, voice rising dramatically, "has built his fence 6 feet inside HOA jurisdiction. 6 feet of injustice, 6 feet of visual pollution." The crowd murmured, some pretending to care, others obviously there for the entertainment. I waited until she finished her first monologue, which included phrases like the sanctity of symmetry and protecting property harmony, before stepping forward with my deed folder tucked neatly under my arm. "Karen," I said calmly, "the county inspector marked those lines himself. You moved the posts last night. At midnight. In your slippers." Her face twitched, but she recovered quickly, flipping through her papers like a magician hiding a bad card trick. "Irrelevant," she declared. "We have a vote from the HOA board affirming the new alignment." The so-called board consisted of Karen, her husband who was hiding behind a coffee thermos, and an elderly neighbor who nodded at anything as long as it didn't interrupt her crossword. One of the other homeowners whispered, "She called me at 2 in the morning to ask for a vote. I thought she was drunk." But Karen ignored that too, pressing on about lake access fairness and historical community maps she claimed to have found online. Then, to make things even more absurd, she pulled out a laminated printout from Google Earth, pointing at a pixelated image of the neighborhood from 2014. "See," she said triumphantly, "the shading indicates that part of the land was maintained by HOA volunteers." I couldn't help but laugh, which only made her angrier. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. "You can't just go around claiming private ownership of shared spirit property." Her invented term hung awkwardly in the air while people exchanged confused looks. "Shared spirit property?" a man repeated. "Is that like timeshare ghosts?" That got a few laughs, and I saw the flush rise in her cheeks. Desperate to regain control, she banged the gavel again and announced that the HOA had voted to fine me $200 per day until the fence violation was corrected. I asked her if she'd like me to pay in Monopoly money, since that was apparently the currency her rules operated on. Her son snorted, then quickly pretended to cough to hide it. At that point I opened my deed folder and laid out the official survey documents on the folding table. The HOA lawyer, a nervous man named Doug who once ran a failed podcast about property disputes, squinted at the maps and said, "Well, technically these look valid, but the bylaws grant the HOA authority over external aesthetics." I asked if aesthetics now meant land theft, but he dodged the question, muttering something about gray areas in community law. The crowd started shifting. A few people were openly filming now, realizing this circus might go viral. One woman whispered, "He's right, you can't just move a fence," and Karen glared at her like a queen betrayed. Then she played her favorite card, victimhood. "All I ever wanted was order," she said dramatically, clutching her pearls, "and this man is making me out to be the villain for simply defending the harmony of our neighborhood." Someone in the back muttered, "You dug holes in the dark," and the entire crowd chuckled again. Karen pounded the gavel so hard the handle snapped off. Sensing her control slipping, she changed tactic. "Fine," she said, "we'll let the county settle this. But I assure you, they'll see I was right. They always side with the HOA." That was when I noticed something new behind her house, freshly placed pink stakes with bright ribbons running across part of my lake path. She had already doubled down before the meeting even started. I took a breath and realized I couldn't argue logic into someone who was building fantasy worlds with fence posts. So I simply said, "Perfect, let the county see," and walked away, leaving her to bask in her own applause. But as I turned the corner back toward my cabin, the sound of her voice carried after me, shouting, "We will not tolerate unauthorized boarders. The HOA stands united." She sounded like a revolutionary leader of a suburban rebellion. Back at my cabin I checked my messages and found one from the sheriff, who had apparently heard the commotion through his scanner. "You having another HOA war?" he wrote. I sent him a single photo of Karen's new stakes, and he replied with a laughing emoji followed by, "Don't touch them, let the county drone log it." I knew he was right again. Patience was my best weapon. Still, the sight of that ribbon slicing across my property line like a neon insult kept gnawing at me. I spent the afternoon pacing, trying to stay calm, while the neighborhood social feed exploded with posts. Karen had uploaded a public service announcement claiming to have protected the lake view for future generations. One comment read, Future generations of what, ducks? And got hundreds of likes before she deleted it. Later that day, 2 HOA volunteers showed up at my door holding clipboards and wearing matching vests that said, Community Compliance Team. They looked nervous but said they were there to document fence inconsistencies. I offered them lemonade and told them to watch their step. The county drone was scheduled to fly over again that evening. That made them visibly uneasy, and they left within minutes, mumbling something about needing Karen's approval. By sunset, the neighborhood had split into factions, Team Karen and Team Sanity. The gossip was relentless. One rumor claimed I had built a secret underground dock, another said Karen had hired a lawyer from out of state. When darkness fell again, I caught the faint glow of flashlights near her backyard. She was at it again, repositioning one of the stakes, probably trying to make it look straighter for the inspector. I didn't bother confronting her this time. I just set up my own camera quietly and let the evidence pile up. The next morning I got a call from the county office saying they had received a formal complaint from the HOA about my fence obstructing lake access. The woman on the phone sounded exhausted, like this wasn't her first Karen encounter. I explained everything briefly, sent her the deed scans, and she sighed with obvious relief. Good, she said. We already have drone footage from last night. It's quite something. That was when I knew Karen's overreach had finally crossed from nuisance to spectacle. When I stepped outside again, a few neighbors approached me privately to apologize for attending her meeting. We just didn't want to get fined, one of them admitted. I told them not to worry. Soon the only person paying fines would be Karen herself. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the crooked pink stakes like flags of defeat waiting to be claimed. The war had just begun, but this time I had allies in the air, allies with cameras sharper than her imagination. By the next morning the chaos had reached a new level because my phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications from the county office, the HOA thread, and a few laughing neighbors who had already seen the leaked drone footage. Apparently, the young county intern in charge of drone operations had shared a short clip in a public work chat, and from there it had spread like wildfire. The video showed Karen in her robe, her flashlight swinging wildly, her son tripping over a bucket, and her shouting, "This is sovereign HOA territory," like some suburban general leading a midnight invasion. It wasn't supposed to be funny, but it was downright cinematic, complete with her falling face-first into the mud while trying to drag a fence post. By the time I arrived at County Hall later that morning, half the office was trying not to laugh when they saw me. The intern, a kid named Wyatt with messy hair and a permanent energy drink in his hand, greeted me like I was a celebrity. "Sir, you have to see this in full resolution," he said, opening his laptop. The footage was absurdly detailed. The drone had circled twice, catching every angle of Karen's operation. You could even hear faint audio from her yelling instructions to her son, "Keep digging. The HOA will remember this day." I couldn't stop smiling as Wyatt added, "She said that about 9 times, sir. It's basically a chant now." The sheriff showed up a few minutes later, wearing his usual calm grin and carrying his travel mug of black coffee. He pulled up a chair beside me, squinting at the screen. "That woman really doesn't believe in sleep, does she?" he muttered. Wyatt rewound the footage to a moment where Karen slipped into a puddle, stood up, and declared, "This fence belongs to the people." The sheriff chuckled. "Which people?" "The voices in her HOA handbook." We watched the full clip twice, both shaking our heads. Then the sheriff turned serious. "All right," he said, "we're filing this as official evidence. Property boundary tampering, trespassing, and unauthorized construction activity." I nodded, finally feeling a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. "So what now?" I asked. "Now," he said, "we let her keep talking. She'll dig her own legal hole deeper than the one she fell into." Wyatt leaned forward with enthusiasm. "I can clip parts of this for the report. Do you want timestamps of her measurements too?" he asked, clearly enjoying his role in the unfolding drama. The sheriff grinned. "Yeah, Make sure to label the part where she declares independence from the county." Wyatt nodded seriously, typing, timestamp 6 minutes and 48 seconds, Declaration of Independence moment. I realized right there how ridiculous the situation had become. This wasn't a simple fence dispute anymore. It was an HOA revolution filmed in night vision. The sheriff told me the county commissioner had already seen the footage, and laughed so hard he spilled coffee on his desk. "We're not just dealing with paperwork anymore," he said. "This is going to a hearing. Public property line verification." That meant Karen's midnight performance was now part of an official investigation. I drove home feeling oddly victorious but also aware that Karen wasn't the type to back down. The neighborhood was unusually quiet when I returned, like everyone was waiting for the next episode of a show they were secretly addicted to. As I walked up my driveway, I noticed a folded piece of paper wedged under my front door mat. It was a printed statement from Karen herself, written in bold letters. "Cease and desist trespassing on HOA land-adjacent property. Failure to comply will result in community action." She had even stamped it with a fake seal that said, "Approved by HOA Council." I laughed out loud, took a photo, and texted it to the sheriff with the caption, "She's escalating." He replied instantly, "Don't worry, we've got the Air Force on our side." That evening, Wyatt called me again, his voice bubbling with excitement. "You won't believe this," he said. "She just called the county office demanding to get a copy of the footage so she can verify its authenticity. She says it's been deep-faked." I nearly dropped my phone laughing. "She's claiming the drone was hacked?" I asked. "Exactly," Wyatt said, "and she told my supervisor that your fence might have magnetized the drone into malfunctioning." It was so absurd I had to sit down. Karen was officially turning the situation into a conspiracy theory. The sheriff texted later that he'd spoken to her personally, and apparently, she accused him of colluding with drone forces. That phrase alone made my entire day. But behind the comedy there was strategy forming. The county had already scheduled a formal site review, which meant inspectors and surveyors would visit my cabin within 48 hours. The sheriff told me to stay calm and let the process unfold. "Let the facts bury her," he said. "No need to lift a shovel." Still, I could feel the tension building because Karen wasn't someone who surrendered quietly. That night I caught sight of her house across the lake. Her lights were still on near midnight again, and silhouettes moved past her window. Maybe she was holding another secret HOA session. I set up my porch camera again, just in case. The next morning I went into town for supplies, and even the store clerk had heard about the fence scandal. "You're the lake guy, right?" he said, barely hiding a grin. "Man, that footage is gold. Someone sent it to me on Facebook." I asked how it even leaked beyond the county, but he shrugged. "Once something that crazy hits a government inbox, it's practically public domain." I bought coffee, nails, and a new lock for my shed, half expecting Karen to expand her conquest to my tool collection next. When I got home, a few neighbors were waiting by the fence, curious and awkward. One of them, an older man named Frank, scratched his head and said, "I told her not to mess with the county lines. You can fight people, but you can't fight GPS." He handed me a copy of the HOA newsletter where Karen had published a statement titled, "Reclaiming Our Community Borders." The article accused me of hoarding lake access, and claimed that the county drone had been biased due to municipal interference. Frank shook his head. "She's gone national with this," he said. "She sent it to the local paper." That night the county drone flew again for its routine mapping pass, and I couldn't help but stand outside to watch it. Its light flickered across the surface of the lake like a ghostly eye, scanning the same area Karen had vandalized. I found it strangely comforting, like a guardian angel with propellers. The sound faded into the distance, but I knew it was logging every inch of my property. Then my phone buzzed again, this time with a new message from Wyatt. "Sir, tomorrow at 9 a.m., site inspection. Please don't fix or move anything. We want her work preserved for evidence." I replied that I wouldn't touch a single post. The next morning dawned clear and cold. I watched from my porch as the county truck pulled up, followed by the sheriff's cruiser. Karen's front door flew open like a stage curtain, and she stormed out in full battle mode, clipboard, sunglasses, and an expression of pure righteousness. "I hope you brought your rulers," she shouted. The sheriff smiled politely and said, "Don't worry, ma'am, we brought the drone too." I almost laughed right there. Wyatt stepped out with his equipment, setting up the portable monitor. Karen folded her arms, looking smug, until the playback started. The drone footage rolled again, showing her midnight adventure in all its glory, projected right there on her own driveway. The crowd of neighbors who had gathered began laughing uncontrollably. Karen sputtered, waving her hands, claiming context manipulation. But the sheriff just said, "The only thing manipulated here was the fence, ma'am." She went red as a tomato. When it was over, the inspector took new measurements, confirmed my property line was correct, and marked everything in red flags that clearly placed her fence inside my land. Karen stormed off, muttering threats about appealing to state authorities. Wyatt packed up, still chuckling. "You couldn't make this stuff up," he said. As the trucks rolled away and peace settled back over the lake, I felt something shift inside me, a calm satisfaction mixed with anticipation. This was far from over. Karen wasn't done, not by a long shot. She'd been humiliated publicly now, and people like her don't retreat quietly. They regroup. And somewhere deep down, I almost looked forward to whatever ridiculous stunt she'd try next, because I had the one ally she could never outsmart, the drone that didn't lie. By the time the county report came through, the neighborhood had turned into a low-budget soap opera, and Karen had decided that losing one public battle meant declaring a private war. She doubled down with a fury that could have powered a small city, hiring 2 contractors to repaint the entire fence in what she called HOA Regulation Beige, a color that looked suspiciously like wet cardboard. I woke up to the sound of hammers again, only this time it wasn't midnight. It was sunrise, and there they were, 2 men in neon vests, slapping fresh paint onto posts that were still sitting 6 feet inside my property. I walked out with my coffee, keeping my voice calm even though I could feel my blood simmering. "Morning, gentlemen," I said. "Do you realize you're painting private property?" One of them shrugged, looking tired. "Talk to the lady with the clipboard," he said. Sure enough, Karen stood behind them, hair tied tight, oversized sunglasses on, barking orders into her phone like a construction foreman who'd watched too many reality shows. She saw me and raised her chin. "Don't worry," she said. "We're just restoring the community aesthetic that your rebellious fencing disrupted." I asked if she'd also restored her sanity or if that was still pending county approval. She ignored that and gestured dramatically at the workers. "These men are here to fix your mistake. You should be thanking me." I walked closer, noting that she'd posted fresh HOA signs along the path, metal plates that read "Restricted Access, HOA members only." The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. "Karen," I said slowly, "you can't just claim other people's land with a sign and a bucket of paint." She gave me that smug half-smile that meant she thought she'd found some loophole. "Oh, but I can," she said. "The HOA bylaws allow for temporary jurisdiction adjustments during active disputes." I almost spit out my coffee. Temporary jurisdiction adjustments? That's not a law. That's something you made up 5 minutes ago. Her son was standing a few yards away, trying to look invisible again, his earbuds in as if hoping music could drown out the embarrassment. She turned to the painters and snapped, "Don't stop. He doesn't own the aesthetic rights." I just stood there watching, amused and furious at once, as one painter carefully stenciled the HOA logo onto one of my boards. When he was done, he looked at me apologetically. "She's paying double," he muttered under his breath. By mid-morning, the neighborhood group chat had exploded again. Pictures of Karen's border project were everywhere, and the comments were ruthless. One neighbor wrote, "Did she annex the lake too?" Another posted a meme of Karen's face photoshopped onto a general's uniform. Even her supporters were starting to distance themselves, claiming they'd been misinformed about the situation. I sat back on my porch and decided to let the storm build on its own. Karen's vanity wouldn't let her stop. The sheriff called later that afternoon, half laughing, half exasperated. "She's filed another complaint," he said, "this time claiming you vandalized her new fence by existing near it." I told him about the repainting and the signs, and he sighed. "Let her finish. The county's got a full team coming Monday. Just don't move a nail." That was fine by me. The more she touched, the more evidence piled up against her. That evening I heard another round of commotion, trucks pulling in, saws whining, and Karen shouting instructions. When I peeked out, I nearly dropped my drink. She wasn't just repainting. She was extending the fence farther toward the lake, building what looked like a small dock platform. I walked down the path and saw her sketching something on a clipboard. "What is this now?" I asked. She smiled like she'd been waiting for that question. "This," she said proudly, "is Phase 2, the HOA Lake Access Dock. You'll thank me when the property value triples." I was speechless for a moment. "You're building a dock on my land," I said flatly. "Correction," she replied, "I'm improving underused community shoreline. The paperwork's already in process." My heart skipped. "What paperwork?" She flipped a page dramatically. "Permit request submitted under HOA development, filed this morning." I realized then she'd forged the documents using the same county office form but listed her address as the project origin. It wasn't just arrogance now, it was fraud. I called the sheriff immediately, who answered on the first ring. "You're not going to believe this," I said. "Try me," he replied. I explained what she was building and how she claimed to have filed a permit. There was a pause, then he said, "All right, don't touch it. Let her finish the dock. The county will love this." The idea of letting her waste money on a structure that would become evidence felt almost poetic. I spent the next 2 days watching construction unfold like a bad sitcom. Karen stood out there with a megaphone, directing workers who clearly hated every minute of it. She even wore a reflective vest that said, "Project Manager." One of the workers asked if she had the property owner's permission, and she replied, "I am the property owner in spirit." That phrase became the talk of the neighborhood within hours. Property owner in spirit. People repeated at barbecues and laughed until tears came. By the end of the weekend, the dock was finished, or rather, a crooked wooden platform half floating over the muddy shore, slanted at an angle that made it look drunk. Karen held a ribbon-cutting ceremony the next morning, complete with balloons, a speaker, and a folding table of pastries. About 15 HOA members attended out of sheer curiosity, some even bringing lawn chairs like they were watching a live play. I stayed on my porch, recording everything. She stepped up to the microphone, holding her speech papers high. "Welcome," she began, "to the dawn of a new community era. This dock represents unity, vision, and environmental innovation." The sheriff's truck pulled up halfway through her sentence, followed by the county vehicle. She froze for half a second but tried to keep her composure. "We are proud to announce," she continued, "that this development increases oxygen flow to the lake by 12%. I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing. The sheriff walked right up beside her, hands in pockets, and said, "Karen, can we borrow your stage for a moment?" She blinked. "Stage? This is a ceremonial platform." He nodded. "Perfect. Let's project something important on it." Wyatt appeared again, rolling out the portable monitor, and within seconds the drone footage flickered to life behind her, bright and undeniable. The crowd gasped as they watched her midnight antics replayed on loop. The moment she realized what was happening was pure theater. Her jaw dropped, her face turned red, and she stammered, "That's not me, that's CGI." The sheriff simply crossed his arms. "Funny," he said, "because CGI doesn't usually involve county timestamps and your voice yelling HOA forever." The crowd burst into laughter. Even her son, who had been hiding behind the snack table, couldn't hold it in. The county inspector stepped forward and handed her the official notice revoking her fake permit, reading it aloud for everyone to hear. Unauthorized construction on private property. Subject to immediate removal and fines. Karen stood frozen, her hands trembling, the clipboard slipping from her grasp. For the first time, she didn't have a comeback. When it was over, the sheriff turned to me and nodded. "You might want to keep that footage. Could win awards someday." As the crowd dispersed, Karen tried to salvage her dignity by announcing, "We'll appeal this decision at the state level." Nobody responded. Even her loyal followers quietly slipped away, leaving her alone by the crooked dock, staring at the water that no longer obeyed her imagination. I went back to my porch, the laughter of neighbors echoing across the lake, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. But I knew Karen's pride wasn't built to surrender. She'd lost the battle, yes, but people like her don't rest, they reload. And as the sun set behind the lake, reflecting off the lopsided dock she'd illegally built, I couldn't help but feel that this was only the intermission of a much bigger show. The morning after the dock disaster felt like the calm after a storm, though it wasn't true calm, more like the silence a volcano gives right before erupting again. I woke up to an inbox full of forwarded links because somehow the video of the county showdown had found its way online. Someone had filmed the entire thing, from Karen's triumphant speech about oxygen levels to the moment the sheriff played her midnight drone footage behind her, and it was spreading faster than she could delete. The thumbnail alone was priceless. Karen frozen mid-gasp, eyes wide, with the caption, "HOA President Caught Red-Handed on County Cam." By breakfast the clip had over 10,000 views and comments pouring in. People were making memes of her yelling, "HOA forever," over dramatic music, and someone even edited it into a fake movie trailer. When I stepped outside, two teenagers biking by stopped and asked, "Hey, you're the fence guy, right? The one who owns the lake?" I sighed, realizing that fame comes in strange forms. The air smelled of wet wood and embarrassment. The crooked dock sat empty and quiet, half of its boards already sagging like a sinking ship. But Karen wasn't gone, oh no. She was plotting. By midday her next move came in the form of paperwork, thick as a phone book, delivered to my porch by a trembling mail carrier. Inside was a letter from Karen's newly hired lawyer, who happened to be her cousin Greg, a man best known for trying to turn magic tricks into legal metaphors. The document accused me of emotional damage inflicted upon the HOA community and defamation via drone collusion. I read it twice, laughing harder each time. It demanded that I take down any and all derogatory materials, including the viral video that wasn't even mine. At the bottom, Greg had signed with a doodled gavel. I texted a photo of it to the sheriff, who replied instantly, "Frame it. That's comedy gold." Still, I decided to play smart. I called my own lawyer, an older man named Pete who dealt with Karen before over property noise complaints. Pete skimmed the pages, chuckled, and said, "Don't worry. This isn't a lawsuit, it's a tantrum on paper." But tantrums have momentum, and within a day Karen had turned her house into a command post. I could hear her through the lake breeze, rallying her few remaining loyalists like a general barking orders. They were printing flyers that said, "Stop the fence fraud," and "Protect HOA integrity." She'd even posted a live video rant on social media, claiming that the drone footage had been AI altered by county insiders. The best part was when she dramatically pointed to the lake and declared, "That man has weaponized surveillance." Meanwhile, her son looked like he wanted the earth to swallow him whole. The sheriff called later that afternoon just to check in. "We've seen her posts," he said. "Don't react. Let her scream into the wind." I told him I planned to do exactly that, but secretly I couldn't resist saving her clips for future laugh. That night, however, things escalated again. Around 11 I heard rustling outside and the sound of wood snapping. My first thought was raccoons, but when I peeked out through the window I saw flashlight beams near the dock. There she was, in a hoodie this time, whispering orders to a couple of her loyal HOA members. They were trying to remove the red county tags from the dock that marked it as illegal construction. I grabbed my phone and started recording from the darkness. One of them tripped and Karen hissed, "Quiet. We have to erase evidence before sunrise." Her whisper was loud enough to echo over the lake. It was almost too perfect. I filmed them for 10 minutes until one of the volunteers finally gave up, muttering, "Karen, this is insane, we could get fined again." She turned on him sharply, her face illuminated by her flashlight, and snapped, "We're protecting democracy." That line sealed her reputation forever. The next morning, I sent the footage straight to the sheriff, who responded within the hour. He arrived with his usual grin, wearing his plain clothes as always, and stood beside me watching the video. "She's out here playing secret agent," he said, shaking his head. "All right, time to make this official." By noon he'd filed another report, this time citing property tampering and violation of county enforcement orders. But the best part came when he suggested we let her know in person. So we drove over together, pulling up right as Karen was holding another impromptu HOA gathering in her driveway. The look on her face when she saw the sheriff's truck could have powered that dock she built. He walked up calmly, handed her a copy of the violation notice, and said, "Ma'am, this is your second county infraction. One more and it becomes a criminal matter." She sputtered, waving her hands. "You can't criminalize community spirit." The sheriff smiled. "No, ma'am, but you can't build docks on private land at midnight either." The crowd laughed, even her allies trying to hold straight faces. Over the next few days, things turned even stranger. Karen started flooding every social media platform with wild accusations that the county was corrupt, that drones were spying on residents, that my fence emitted radio interference. She even tried to hold a Freedom from Fence Suppression march, but only 3 people showed up, and one of them left halfway through for lunch. Still, she was relentless. Flyers appeared again, this time blaming the sheriff for overstepping his rural authority. The irony was that the more she fought, the more people distanced themselves from her. The HOA treasurer resigned, the secretary moved out, and by the end of the week, the HOA's own funds were frozen because of pending investigations into improper project allocation. Translation: she spent community money on her illegal dock. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet, keeping my porch routine the same. Coffee at sunrise, quiet evenings by the lake, cameras rolling just in case. I could see the frustration eating at her. Every time she looked across the lake, she saw me sitting calmly while her empire crumbled. Then came the twist nobody expected. The local news showed up. They wanted an interview about the viral fence feud. I tried to decline, but they insisted, saying it had become a symbol of small-town resilience versus bureaucratic madness. They filmed me explaining the situation, with the sheriff confirming details. The segment aired that night under the headline, "HOA Gone Wild, Fence Gate at Pine Lake." Karen must have seen it because 10 minutes later she posted a video of her own, standing by her dock, yelling about fake journalism. It was pure performance art by that point. The following morning, a county notice appeared on her property. The headline read, "HOA jurisdiction suspended pending legal review." It meant her entire HOA authority had been stripped until further notice. I half expected her to faint, but she held firm, stomping around the yard yelling into her phone. Then, in a move that shocked even me, she tried to appeal directly to the state governor, sending a letter accusing the entire county of fence-based discrimination. By evening, that letter was trending online, and the internet dubbed her Midnight Karen of Pine Lake. The comments were merciless but hilarious, and even local businesses were making jokes. A coffee shop down the road added a new drink called the HOA Latte, extra bitter with a fence-shaped stir stick. When I saw the sheriff later that week, he said, "You know, I've dealt with some strange people in my time, but she's rewriting the manual." He handed me a copy of the final county report, thick and official, listing every infraction she'd committed. "This is it," he said. "Next stop, court." I looked out across the lake, the crooked dock standing like a monument to her stubbornness, and realized the story had outgrown her control. She wasn't just fighting me anymore, she was fighting reality itself. The neighborhood had turned, the county had ruled, and the world was laughing. But something told me she wasn't finished. People like Karen never accept endings, they try to rewrite them. And as night fell over the quiet lake, a single thought lingered in my mind. The battle for the fence was over, but the war for her pride was just getting started. By the time the county suspended the HOA, Karen's world had started cracking like glass under pressure, but instead of stopping she doubled her madness, wrapping herself in new delusions and doubling down on old ones. The neighborhood that once humored her now watched from behind blinds, whispering about her with the same tone people use when describing a slow-motion car crash. Every morning she would march to the lake in her wide-brimmed hat, holding a clipboard and muttering about constitutional property rights. She'd stop at the crooked dock like a fallen queen inspecting her ruins, glaring across the water at my cabin as if my calmness personally offended her. I tried ignoring her, but she had a gift for finding new ways to provoke chaos. One afternoon I came home to find dozens of photocopied papers taped to my gate, each one with her favorite accusation typed in all caps. Trespasser, fence fraudster, HOA enemy. She even stuck one on my mailbox that said, "Pending investigation by federal authorities." The mailman just shook his head and said, "She's got too much printer ink." Then came the lawsuit, or at least what she called one. Greg, her cousin lawyer, filed a stack of nonsense paperwork at the local clerk's office, accusing me of psychological warfare through laughter and unlawful interference with community morale. Pete, my lawyer, nearly fell out of his chair laughing when he read it. "She's suing you for having a sense of humor," he said. The judge tossed it before it even reached a hearing, labeling it frivolous and unintelligible. That should have ended it, but with Karen, logic was never a stop sign, just a speed bump. A day later she hosted what she called the People's Tribunal of Pine Lake on her driveway. She invited half the neighborhood, though only 5 people came, 2 out of curiosity, 1 for the free donuts, and 2 because they thought it was a yard sale. She stood behind a folding table draped in an American flag, holding a toy gavel she must have bought from a party store, declaring herself acting HOA president under emergency powers. Her speech was a rambling blend of HOA bylaws, conspiracy theories, and self-pity. "We are under attack by fake maps and digital manipulation," she shouted. "The drones are not neutral, the deeds are not real, and the fence is a lie." One of her former allies whispered to me later, "She's gone full HOA dictator." The sheriff stopped by that evening, clearly amused but slightly concerned. "She's one complaint away from getting herself arrested," he said. "The county judge already warned her twice." I asked if we could finally remove the illegal dock, but he shook his head. "Not yet. Let the process finish. Once she loses in court, it'll all be torn down officially. Cleaner that way." I respected that, even though every time I saw that lopsided dock I wanted to set it on fire just for symmetry's sake. Karen must have sensed I was holding back because she started spreading new rumors, that I was bribing the sheriff, that I'd faked the drone footage, that I was building a private resort with plans to evict everyone nearby. The absurd part was that some people believed her, at least for a few hours, until they saw her next outburst online. She live-streamed herself standing in front of her house at midnight, waving her clipboard, yelling, "You can't silence the HOA spirit," while her son filmed in silent mortification. By morning the clip had gone viral again, with captions like, "Karen declares independence from reality." But for every public humiliation, she found a new way to make trouble. One morning the water company called me saying my meter had been reported as illegally siphoned. I knew immediately it was her. The investigator came out, looked around, saw the drone sticker on my mailbox and said, "Oh, you're that guy. Yeah, this is nonsense. We'll file it under Karen. Even the county offices had developed a shorthand for her chaos. That night I saw her pacing by the dock again, phone pressed to her ear, ranting about appealing to federal zoning boards. I decided to check the cameras the next morning, and sure enough, around 3 a.m., she had wandered back toward the fence line again. But this time she wasn't alone. She had brought her small group of remaining followers, carrying flashlights, tape measures, and clipboards, trying to take new community measurements. Halfway through the footage, she tripped into one of the property trenches the county had left open for restaking, fell face-first into mud, and shouted, "I'll sue this land." I didn't even bother calling the sheriff. The cameras saw everything, and at this point, it was safer to let her keep building her own disaster. 2 days later the sheriff came by again, holding a fresh report. "You're going to love this," he said. "She's accused the county of bias and requested a state-level review." He paused, grinning. The state laughed and sent it back with a note that said, "Good luck with that." Still, Karen wasn't done. She stormed into the county office herself, demanding a personal audience with the commissioner. The staff there, bless them, had set up a special protocol just for her visits. Turn on the recorder, stay polite, and wait for her to leave. She told them that I'd been operating an unauthorized drone alliance, and that I had friends in aerial places. They handed her a pamphlet about property law and wished her luck. When she came home that night, she must have realized the tide was against her, because her next move was desperate. She filed a police report claiming someone had stolen her emotional fence. The sheriff, trying not to laugh, filed it under miscellaneous nonsense and moved on. Meanwhile, the community around us started to recover. Without her constant interference, people began repainting their own homes, fixing gardens, and even organizing a proper neighborhood barbecue. They invited me as a kind of honorary guest, the man who had outlasted Karen. I almost didn't go, but curiosity won. When I showed up, everyone cheered. Someone handed me a burger and said, "You're the reason this place is peaceful again." But as I looked around, I noticed Karen's house sitting dark and quiet at the end of the street. She wasn't gone, just waiting. Sure enough, the next morning I saw her car leave early, trunk packed, heading toward the county courthouse again. I knew exactly what she was doing. She was going to file yet another motion, one last desperate attempt to regain control. The sheriff texted me later that day, "She's in court. Bring popcorn." He wasn't kidding. The hearing lasted less than 10 minutes. The judge listened to her long speech about aerial surveillance injustice and moral land boundaries before interrupting her with a single sentence. "Ma'am, this case has no standing, no evidence, and no relevance." Karen tried to argue, but the judge raised a hand. "Please leave the courtroom before I fine you for wasting everyone's time." She stormed out, red-faced, waving her papers like a defeated general retreating from battle. The sheriff met me outside the courthouse afterward and said, "It's over. The state's done with her. The county's done with her. She's got nowhere left to appeal." I asked what would happen next, and he smiled. "Next week we start removing her dock." That evening, as the sun set over the lake, I stood on my porch and watched the orange glow reflect off the crooked dock that had caused so much chaos. For the first time, I felt something close to peace. The air was still, the water calm, and even the crickets seemed quieter, like the land itself was relieved. But deep down, I knew Karen's pride wouldn't let her fade quietly. Somewhere out there, she was planning something. Maybe another scheme, maybe another letter, maybe one last spectacle. I took a slow breath, sipping my coffee, and whispered to myself, "Let her try. The drone never sleeps." The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and tension the morning Karen finally had her day of reckoning, and even though I told myself I wouldn't enjoy it, there was something almost cinematic about walking into that building knowing that months of madness were about to end. The county courtroom was small, sunlight spilling through high windows, dust floating lazily in the beams like confetti waiting for the moment justice would land. Karen was already there when I walked in, seated at the plaintiff's table surrounded by a half-circle of stacked binders and a giant poster board that said, Exhibit A, The Truth About the Fence. Her cousin Greg, the magician lawyer, was frantically flipping through papers as if he might conjure a defense out of thin air. The rest of the room was filled with curious neighbors, a couple of reporters, and the sheriff leaning casually against the back wall, arms crossed and a half-smile hiding under his mustache. I took my seat quietly at the defense table beside Pete, who whispered, "This'll be over faster than she can say HOA rights." The judge entered, a woman with the patient but tired eyes of someone who had probably dealt with every variety of local insanity imaginable. She called the session to order, and Karen immediately jumped to her feet, declaring that this was a day for justice, restoration, and fence redemption. The judge asked her to sit down. Karen didn't. She launched into a 20-minute monologue about unauthorized boundary lines and theft of communal spirit, her voice rising with every sentence until it was less of a statement and more of a sermon. She slammed her hand on the table for emphasis, rattling her water bottle, and at one point pointed directly at me, shouting, "He conspired with drones." The courtroom erupted in murmurs, and the judge had to call for silence twice. Pete leaned over to me and muttered, "We should start selling popcorn." When Karen finally stopped to breathe, Greg took over, attempting to sound professional while citing neighborly precedent and aesthetic obligation statutes that didn't exist. The judge blinked slowly, then asked, "Counselor, are you aware that the county's official survey and footage have already disproven your client's claim?" Greg started sweating, fumbling with his papers. "Your Honor, those materials were produced under questionable drone ethics." That was the moment Wyatt, the young drone operator, stood up from the audience holding the county laptop. "Your Honor," he said cheerfully, "would you like to review the footage again?" The judge nodded. When the video began to play on the courtroom monitor, you could have heard a pin drop. There it was again. The infamous midnight scene of Karen in her robe, tape measure in hand, whisper yelling at her son to move the posts faster. The moment she slipped in the mud drew a few stifled chuckles from the crowd. Karen's face turned the color of overripe tomatoes. She tried to interject, waving her arms, but the judge silenced her with one raised finger. The footage continued, showing her planting the stolen posts, declaring HOA sovereignty, and yelling, "The HOA forever," at the end. By the time it ended, even Greg looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. The judge sighed deeply, rubbed her temples, and said, "I've seen many things in this courtroom, but this is a first." The sheriff stepped forward to confirm the authenticity of the footage and summarize the months of reports, including the forged permit for the illegal dock. The judge listened quietly, flipping through the case file, and then leaned back. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, using Karen's full name, "you have not only violated property law but repeatedly defied county orders, misused HOA funds, and harassed your neighbor with false accusations. Do you have anything to say before I issue my ruling?" Karen stood there trembling, clutching her clipboard like it was a life raft. "Yes," she said finally, her voice cracking, "I did what I had to do for the good of this community. The lake deserves order. The HOA was my family." Her words hung in the air, strange and hollow, as if even she didn't fully believe them anymore. The judge nodded slowly. "And families," she said, "sometimes need boundaries. Literal ones." Then she slammed the gavel. The ruling was clear. Karen was fined heavily for trespassing and fraud, ordered to dismantle the dock at her own expense, and officially stripped of all HOA authority. The remaining board was disbanded, and the HOA's charter suspended indefinitely. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in restrained laughter and relieved whispers. The sheriff clapped me on the shoulder and said quietly, "Congratulations, you just survived the world's weirdest legal war." Karen tried one last act of defiance, standing up to shout, "This isn't over!" But the judge was already leaving the bench. Greg tried to calm her down, whispering something about appeal deadlines, but she brushed him off and stormed out of the room. Cameras flashed as she passed the hallway, reporters shouting questions she ignored. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered like it was the end of a long-running TV series. Frank, the older neighbor, approached me and said, "I'll be honest, I didn't think you'd make it through this without losing your mind." I laughed and told him I almost didn't. The sheriff joined us, lighting a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have near the building, and said, "Well, that's one for the books. I'll file it under community theater." Over the next few days, the news spread everywhere. Local papers called it the Great Fence Trial. Even a national outlet picked up the story briefly, turning Karen into a meme again. Her picture appeared beside headlines about HOA extremism and the dangers of overmanagement. She went silent for nearly a week, her house dark, her car unmoved. People whispered that she might finally be leaving, but then one evening, just as the sun set over the lake, I saw lights flicker inside her living room again. Curiosity got the better of me, so I watched from my porch. Through the window I could see her sitting alone at her table, surrounded by empty binders and loose papers, staring at the wall. For the first time since this started, she looked small. Not furious, not triumphant, just lost. A strange twinge of pity crept in, but it passed quickly when I remembered the months of chaos she'd caused. The sheriff stopped by that night, still in plain clothes, carrying 2 beers. He handed me one and said, "You know, I think you handled this better than most would have. Some people would have built a moat by now." I smiled and said, "Funny you mention that, I thought about it." We stood there in silence, watching the reflection of the moon on the water. The crooked dock still stood, waiting for its demolition crew, a symbol of stubborn pride refusing to sink. "She'll appeal, won't she?" I asked. He shrugged. "Maybe. But nobody's listening anymore. Her HOA crown's rusted." We both laughed quietly. The following morning, a county crew arrived to post official notices around Karen's property. Bright orange signs reading, "Condemned structure, removal required." She came out screaming again, waving her phone, threatening to call higher authorities. The workers ignored her, calm and efficient, marking each post of her dock with spray paint. One of them even whistled while working. She stood there helplessly as the same system she tried to control moved against her, every rule and law she once wielded now spelling her defeat. When the last sign was nailed in, she retreated inside, slamming her door hard enough to echo across the lake. That evening, the neighborhood gathered near my porch. Someone brought food, someone else played guitar, and for the first time in months, laughter drifted freely across the water. The sheriff stopped by again, holding a mason jar of lemonade this time instead of beer. "You did it," he said simply. "You got your land, your peace, and your fence back." I nodded, staring at the quiet waterline. "Yeah," I said, "but she'll be back for one more round, I can feel it." He smiled knowingly. "Let her come. The county's ready. And so's the drone." We both laughed as the sound of the insects rose around us, the lake reflecting the fading light like a mirror that had finally settled after a long storm. For once there was calm, but it was the kind of calm that knows the story isn't quite over yet, just waiting for its final chapter to land. The morning the county crew came to dismantle the dock felt like the true ending of a long and ridiculous war, and yet there was something strangely solemn about it, as if the lake itself was watching a funeral for common sense. I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee, the air cool and still, the faint hum of the truck engine carrying across the water. The workers moved efficiently, sawing through the warped boards Karen had declared her monument to community spirit. Each plank fell with a satisfying crack, echoing across the calm surface of the lake. Karen's house remained closed and silent, curtains drawn like a stage where the final act had ended and the star refused to come out for the curtain call. The sheriff pulled up in his usual calm fashion, parking beside the crew and walking over with his hands in his pockets. He nodded toward the dock and said, "Funny how something that caused so much noise goes down so quietly." I smiled, sipping my coffee, feeling the weight of months of frustration slowly lift. As the dock pieces were loaded into the truck, I noticed something small glinting in the mud near one of the fence posts. A cheap little plastic crown, the kind children get at dollar stores. I picked it up, realizing it must have fallen from one of Karen's old HOA party decorations, and I couldn't help but laugh at how perfectly symbolic it was. By noon the dock was gone, leaving nothing but disturbed soil and a few crooked stakes poking out like the scars of a healed wound. The lake looked wider, cleaner, freer, as if it had been holding its breath all this time. Neighbors started coming out one by one, some waving from porches, others walking down to the water's edge to watch the final cleanup. Frank brought his fishing rod and cast a line, muttering, "Back to normal, finally." For the first time in months, nobody was shouting, nobody was measuring, nobody was posting accusations online. Even the birds seemed louder, reclaiming the soundscape from HOA drama. I sat down by the fence and felt a strange quiet satisfaction, part victory, part relief, part exhaustion. Then, just as I began to think it was really over, the mail truck pulled up. The driver handed me a postcard, the glossy kind you buy at gas stations, showing a generic beach scene with palm trees. The handwriting on the back was unmistakable, written in thick black ink. "Your fence looks crooked. Regards, Karen." I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my coffee. The sheriff came over to see what was so funny, and when I showed him, he grinned and said, "Frame it. Call it a warning label." Later that afternoon, the county inspector returned for one final sign-off. He walked the property line slowly, clipboard in hand, checking the new stakes and taking photos. When he reached the edge of my driveway, he looked up and said, "Everything's in order now. You officially own every inch you fought for." Hearing that sentence was more satisfying than I'd expected. It wasn't about the land itself. It was about the principle, the months of nonsense that finally had a clean ending. As he left, Wyatt's drone appeared again in the sky, hovering silently above the water like a guardian spirit doing its last patrol. Its faint buzz drifted over the lake, circling once before heading back toward the county station. I watched it disappear into the horizon, feeling strangely grateful for that little machine that had changed everything. The sheriff clapped me on the back and said, "Well, partner, looks like peace is back in session." I nodded, but I couldn't help glancing across the water toward Karen's house. For the first time since the chaos began, it looked smaller, lonelier. Her car was gone. Her for sale sign leaned crooked in the yard, already collecting dust. A week later, she was officially gone. The house stood empty, its lawn overgrown, her old HOA president sign faded and forgotten by the mailbox. The new owners, a quiet retired couple, introduced themselves with warm smiles and a plate of cookies, saying they'd heard there'd been a little excitement here last year. I told them it was nothing worth remembering in detail and welcomed them to the peace of Pine Lake. But even as calm returned, the legend of Karen lingered in every conversation, every joke, every passing comment about fences or property lines. It became folklore, something people laughed about during barbecues and fishing trips. "Remember the time she moved the fence at midnight?" became a punchline, and I didn't mind being the story's main character. The whole ordeal had turned into a strange badge of honor, a reminder that sometimes doing nothing and letting people hang themselves with their own rope was the smartest move of all. Months later, when spring came and the wildflowers bloomed again along the lake edge, I decided to rebuild the fence one final time, stronger and straighter than ever. I called Frank and the sheriff to help, and by mid-morning, the three of us were hammering posts and laughing about old times. Wyatt even showed up with the drone to film it, saying he wanted to make the sequel. We worked all day until the fence stood tall and perfect, sunlight glinting off the new wood. The sheriff wiped the sweat from his brow and said, "You realize this fence is now the most famous property line in the county." I grinned and said, "Let's make it official then." He pulled out a marker and wrote on one of the corner posts, "Karen Free Zone." Everyone laughed until they cried. When we finished, we stood back to admire it, the drone hovering above capturing the moment. Wyatt called down, "Smile, gentlemen, this one's for the archives." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the lake turned gold, I sat on the porch again, listening to the sounds of the world returning to normal. The new fence looked beautiful, clean lines against the backdrop of calm water. I felt an unfamiliar stillness in my chest, not just relief but gratitude. For the sheriff's patience, for the county's sense of humor, for the neighbors who stuck around through the storm. As twilight deepened, I heard footsteps on the path, and the sheriff appeared again, carrying 2 mugs of coffee this time. He handed me one and sat down beside me. "You think she'll ever come back?" he asked. I took a slow sip, staring at the faint stars reflected in the lake. "No," I said, "but I bet she's still filing something somewhere." He chuckled, shaking his head. "If she ever does, we'll just send the drone." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the frogs starting to sing, the air thick with the scent of pine and lake mist. Then he pulled something from his pocket, the postcard Karen had sent, and nailed it gently onto one of the new fence posts. "There," he said, "now it's official property art." I laughed, realizing how fitting it was, her final words literally pinned to the fence she once fought over. The wind rustled through the trees, and the moon rose higher, casting silver light across the calm water. For the first time in months, I felt like the story had finally settled, every thread tied, every absurdity resolved. The fence stood firm, the dock was gone, the HOA was history, and peace, real, quiet, simple peace, had finally come home to the lake. The sheriff raised his mug slightly and said, "To fences that stay where they belong." I clinked mine against his and replied, "And drones that never miss a thing." We laughed softly as the drone buzzed faintly in the distance one last time, circling the lake like a faithful witness, before fading into the dark sky above Pine Lake.